Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Today, we are undertaking a comprehensive deep dive into Baroque architecture.
Right, which is a pivotal chapter in our History of Architecture series. It is such a massive, complex topic.
It really is. We're going to examine how, from the late 16th century all the way to the mid-18th century, the built environment was entirely re-engineered.
Completely overhauled on a global scale.
Exactly. The mission here is to unpack the mechanics, the history, and the geographical evolution of this style. We want to see exactly how architecture shifted from the measured mathematical harmony of the Renaissance into something else entirely.
Into a deliberate physical tool used for ideological messaging, right?
Yes, religious persuasion and just, absolute political dominance. But to understand how architecture became a weapon for the mind, we have to look at the battlefield it emerged from.
And that battlefield was firmly defined by the Council of Trent.
Right.
Which was a series of highly charged meetings held by high-ranking Catholic Church officials between, 1545 and 1563.
And they were essentially in full crisis mode, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther and several others, was just tearing Europe apart.
Because the Protestants were looking at the Catholic Church and arguing that it had become corrupt, right? That it was overly wealthy and distracted by material excess.
Right, exactly. So in response, many Protestant sects embraced total austerity. They stripped their churches completely bare.
They engaged in iconoclasm, literally smashing stained glass and destroying statues.
Yeah, they argued that believers should focus purely on the text of the scripture, and not on graven images.
So the Council of Trent is basically the Catholic Church's massive counteroffensive.
Precisely. It is the defining moment of the Counter-Reformation. And rather than agreeing with the Protestants and stripping their own churches down, the Catholic officials, they doubled down.
They leaned into the art.
Exactly. They issued decrees stating that art, painting, sculpture, and specifically architecture had to serve a didactic and devotional purpose.
It had to teach the faith.
It had to teach the faith, yes, but more importantly, it had to compel devotion. They decided to use stone, glass, and paint to actively control populations and project absolute authority.
I want to pause on the contrast here because I don't think you can fully grasp how radical this shift was unless you know what the architects were doing right before this moment.
Right, during the Renaissance.
Exactly. For a couple of centuries prior, from the 14th to the early 17th centuries, the Renaissance ruled the day. And Renaissance architecture was essentially a pure science.
They were totally obsessed with the ruins of ancient Greece and Rome. They prized symmetry, perfect proportion, balance, and, rational humanism.
It was an architecture of intellect.
Yeah. Think of the work of someone like Filippo Brunelleschi or Leon Battista Alberti. They actually believed that the universe was ordered by divine mathematics.
So a building should reflect that mathematical perfection.
Exactly. A Renaissance building is designed to be easily and quickly understood by the rational mind. You look at it, you see the perfect squares, the perfect circles, the proportional ratios, and your mind is put at ease by the order of it all.
So if the Renaissance is a perfectly structured, logically sound academic essay where all the premises align perfectly, the Baroque style is completely different.
Oh, it is a high-production stage play. It drops the logical argument entirely and goes straight for the emotional jugular.
Which really begins to take hold around 1580 in Italy.
Right. The goal is no longer to make you think about divine order. The goal is to make you feel it, to physically overwhelm the viewer.
And the Catholic Church, specifically new militant religious orders like the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola, they took this style and weaponized it to halt the Protestant schism.
A perfect example of this weaponization is the Church of the Gesù in Rome. It was consecrated in 1584, and it serves as the great proto-Baroque prototype.
How is it different from a Renaissance church?
Well, prior to this, many Renaissance churches used centralized plans. They were often perfectly round or cross-shaped with equal arms.
Which is mathematically beautiful, I assume.
Beautiful, yeah, but not great for preaching to large crowds. And the Jesuits needed crowds to hear their sermons. So the Church of the Gesù features a massive, wide, unified nave.
So they removed the side aisles.
Exactly. There are no side aisles to obstruct the view or the acoustics. Instead, they used lateral chapels along the sides. And right at the crossing, before the altar, they placed a prominent dome.
To draw the eye up.
Yes, but also designed to act almost like a massive spotlight. It focused attention downward and simulated a moment of divine intervention right where the priest was speaking.
It is entirely theatrical. It makes me wonder about the architects of this era. If they are designing buildings specifically to manipulate a crowd's emotional state, did they view themselves as traditional builders, or were they operating more as propagandists?
They were operating under a very specific philosophical and theological framework called causal realism.
Causal realism. What does that mean in this context?
It was central to Counter-Reformation theology. The Protestants favored rationalism and textual austerity. You read the Word of God, you understand it intellectually.
Right.
But the Catholic approach, through causal realism, argued that the physical world, the sensory world, was a completely valid pathway to the divine. It was an empirical appeal to human senses.
So the belief was that architectural splendor could causally induce awe and reverence.
Exactly. And ultimately, absolute submission to papal orthodoxy. By engineering massive vaulted cupolas, employing extreme light and shadow, and painting illusions on the ceilings, they were literally engineering spaces to simulate infinity.
That brings up a massive technical question for me. It is one thing for a pope to say, build me a church that looks like infinity.
Well, much easier said than done.
Yeah, it is an entirely different thing for an architect to actually take heavy, rigid blocks of stone and make them do that. To understand how they distorted space and manipulated emotion, we have to open up the Baroque toolkit.
Let's do it.
And it starts with the most fundamental element of architecture, which is the arch. Now, physically, a basic arch works by transferring weight.
Right. You have a central stone at the top, the keystone.
Gravity pushes down on it, and it distributes that weight outward and downward along the wedge-shaped stones, which are called voussoirs. The weight travels past the spring line, the point where the arch begins to curve, and goes straight down the pillars into the ground.
Placing everything under compression. That is standard Roman engineering.
But the Baroque architects refused to use the arch just for basic support, didn't they?
They pushed it to its extreme aesthetic limits. Instead of a simple semicircle, they began using broken pediments.
What is a broken pediment exactly?
Well, a pediment is that triangular structure you see above classical temples, like the Parthenon. Renaissance architects loved intact, perfect pediments above doors and windows.
Okay, I can picture that.
Baroque architects would take that triangle and snap it in half. They would leave a gaping hole in the center, sometimes shoving a statue or an ornate crest right into the rupture.
That sounds like it would create a lot of visual tension.
It creates severe tension. It looks restless. They used deep, layered arches to frame altars, creating curves within curves.
Which generated an ever-changing play of light and deep shadow, right?
Yes, chiaroscuro in architectural form. And that became the defining characteristic of this theatrical aesthetic.
They took functional load-bearing elements and turned them into instruments of drama. And we see this exact same subversion happen with the column.
Oh, absolutely.
In classical architecture, you have the standard orders, the visual vocabulary everyone agreed on for centuries. You have the plain, sturdy Doric column. You have the Ionic column with the scroll-like volute at the top.
And you have the Corinthian column, decorated with those ornate acanthus leaves.
Right, and those classical columns are all about expressing weight and stability. A classical column tapers slightly at the top, a technique called entasis.
Which makes it look muscular and strong, like it is naturally bearing a heavy load.
But the Baroque architects completely manipulated this.
They did. They heavily popularized the Solomonic column, for one.
Which basically looks like a giant stone corkscrew.
Exactly. The shaft of the column spirals wildly. And visually, a spiral does not look stable at all. It looks like it is in motion.
It creates an optical illusion of restless upward energy, drawing the eye toward the ceiling.
They also utilize something called the estipit. The estipit is essentially an inverted cone or an obelisk shape.
So the narrowest part is at the bottom.
Yes, the narrowest part is often at the bottom, and it gets wider as it goes up. It completely defies the visual logic of a traditional weight-bearing pillar.
It makes the viewer feel disoriented because the building appears to be balancing on points.
Exactly. And then you have the dome. If you look at the Renaissance, domes were perfect, symmetrical hemispheres. They were representations of the perfect cosmos.
But in the Baroque period, they just throw that perfect circle out.
Entirely. Domes become complex, irregular geometries. They are pear-shaped, they are oval, they are multi-lobed like a clover.
And on the inside, architects filled them with incredibly deep, elaborate stucco carvings and heavy gilding.
But the most crucial element was how they manipulated light using oculi.
An oculus is a window, right?
Yeah.
Often circular.
Yes, hidden within the structure of the dome. In the Baroque era, they would design the dome so that the congregation standing on the floor could not actually see the window itself.
They could only see the beam of light cutting through the space.
Right, illuminating a specific statue or a golden starburst at the top of the altar. The light appears to have no physical source. It looks supernatural.
It directs the viewer's eye upward into a profound sense of divine grandeur. And when you look upward, you do not just see stone, you see quadratura.
Quadratura is fascinating. It is a highly specific, mathematically rigorous type of trompe-l'oeil ceiling paintings.
So an optical illusion.
Yes. The artist would calculate the exact perspective from a specific standing point on the floor of the church. They would paint false architecture like fake columns, fake arches, onto the curved ceiling.
So that it perfectly matched the real, physical stone columns of the church.
Exactly. The result is that the solid roof visually erases itself. When you look up, it appears as if the building simply continues upward into the heavens.
And they would paint figures of angels or mythological figures known as Atlantes, appearing to physically hover over the edge of this fake architecture, looking down at you.
It requires an intense mastery of geometry. The architecture provides the frame, but the painting completely dissolves the boundary between the physical, earthly space and the spiritual realm.
And this rejection of simple geometry extends to the very floor plans of the buildings. Renaissance architects loved the static circle and the perfect square.
But Baroque architects favored the oval, specifically complex, interlocking oval plans.
Why the oval, though? What does an oval do that a circle does not?
Well, a circle is static. Every point on the edge is equidistant from the center. If you stand in the middle of a circular room, you feel at rest.
Right, feels resolved.
But an oval inherently has two different axes, a long one and a short one. It creates dynamic opposition and spatial tension.
It implies movement, as if a circle has been stretched or compressed by invisible forces.
Exactly. When you walk into an oval church, your eye cannot easily settle on a single peaceful center point. It forces your gaze to move continuously around the perimeter. It prevents you from ever feeling entirely at rest in the space.
Wait, if we look at all these mechanics, the corkscrew columns, inverted obelisks, stretched oval floor plans, and domes shaped like clovers, it sounds like they are actively trying to break the established rules of classical physics.
They definitely wanted it to look that way.
They are taking thousands of tons of heavy masonry and making it look like it is floating in the air or twisting like soft fabric. But gravity still exists. How did they actually prevent these incredibly complex buildings from just caving in on themselves under the weight of such irregular geometries?
That is where the hidden structural ingenuity of the period comes in. The intense theatricality on the surface was supported by heavy, advanced engineering behind the walls.
So they weren't just guessing.
Oh no. To support these elliptical vaults and complex oval domes that completely defied standard Euclidean regularity, they mastered the use of pendentives.
Let's break down a pendentive, because it is crucial here. If you have a square room, but you want to put a round or oval dome on top of it, you have a massive geometric problem.
Right. The base of the dome does not match the straight walls of the room. The corners of the square room are left entirely uncovered.
So a pendentive is a curved, triangular section of vaulting. It essentially acts as a three-dimensional bracket.
Exactly. It springs from the corner of the square room, curving inward and upward, and it meets the other three pendentives at the top to form a continuous circular or elliptical base.
And the heavy weight of the dome rests on that continuous base.
And the pendentives funnel thousands of tons of downward thrust smoothly into the four corners of the room and down into the massive piers holding up the structure. It is a brilliant piece of load distribution.
They also used reinforced ribbed structures within the domes, right? Acting like a skeletal frame.
Yeah, which allowed them to construct those weird, multi-lobed vaults that were structurally sound despite their unconventional pinched shapes. They merged intense, rigorous mathematical calculation with intense emotional theatricality.
All of these tools and engineering feats were incubated and perfected in Italy, which brings us to the height of the movement, the Roman High Baroque.
Spanning roughly from 1625 to 1675.
And this era is utterly defined by the fierce, bitter rivalry between two master architects who took this Baroque toolkit and pushed it to its physical limits in entirely different directions. Gianlorenzo Bernini and Francesco Borromini.
Let's start with Bernini. He is often described as the golden child of Rome.
He was charming, socially adept, heavily favored by multiple popes, and he was what we would call a universal artist.
Right. He was a sculptor, an architect, a theatrical set designer, and an urban planner. He was a master of staging public events on a massive scale.
His most monumental architectural achievement is right at the center of the Catholic world, isn't it?
St. Peter's Square in Rome, absolutely, which he designed beginning in 1657. The square is actually an enormous ellipse.
He designed these massive, sweeping, curved colonnades made of 4 rows of massive Doric columns.
And the symbolism is explicit. Bernini himself stated it. The colonnades represent the embracing arms of the maternal Catholic Church, reaching out to welcome pilgrims from across the world.
It is an architectural hug on an imperial scale, and when you walk through those embracing arms and go inside St. Peter's Basilica, you encounter another of his masterworks.
Right under the massive central dome, Bernini designed the bronze baldacchino.
This is an enormous multi-story canopy built between 1624 and 1633 to mark the high altar and the tomb of St. Peter.
It features 4 massive, spiraling Solomonic columns made of dark bronze. The bronze itself was actually stripped from the roof of the ancient Roman Pantheon to build it.
Which is a whole other controversy. But the scale of the baldacchino is hard to comprehend. It is as tall as a modern 10-story building, but it sits entirely inside the church.
It commands the vast, overwhelming space of the basilica with intense dramatic flair. Bernini excelled at the monumental, the symbolic, and the welcoming. He used architecture to make the church feel unassailable, grand, and triumphant.
But his contemporary, Francesco Borromini, approached the Baroque from a completely different psychological space.
Borromini was notoriously difficult. He was melancholic, obsessive, introverted, and lacked Bernini's easy charm.
He often wore austere, dark clothing in stark contrast to the colorful papal court. But as an architect, Borromini possessed a structural genius that arguably surpassed Bernini's.
He did not just want to decorate space, he wanted to warp the boundaries of structural form itself.
The urgent expression of the Borromini's obsession is the Church of San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane in Rome, which he began in 1634.
The plot of land he was given to build on was tiny. It was awkwardly shaped and located right at an intersection with 4 fountains.
What he did with that tiny space is mind-bending. He utilized an innovative, highly pinched oval plan for the interior. But it is the exterior facade that is truly radical.
He designed a complex interplay of convex and concave curves.
A convex curve pushes outward toward you. A concave curve bows inward away from you.
And Borromini stacked these curves across the 2-story facade. It creates an undulating surface that appears to physically breathe. It looks less like rigid stone and more like a heavy curtain waving in a strong wind.
I try to imagine a 17th century person walking down the street and seeing a stone building rippling like water. It must have looked like sorcery.
It really must have.
This rivalry between Bernini and Borromini is so intense. They despised each other, but it really seems like their competition is the engine that drove the Roman style into such extreme territory.
Definitely. Bernini's approach is like a grand outward gesture. Borromini's work is a dizzying, complex mathematical puzzle that pulls you inward.
Yet both of them are striving for the same ultimate goal, a concept known as the Gesamtkunstwerk.
Which translates to a total work of art. It is the seamless, absolute integration of architecture, sculpture, and painting into a single, unified artistic experience.
This concept is the defining essence of the Italian Baroque. The emotional impact is not generated by simply slapping a pretty painting onto a flat, static wall.
No, the architecture itself physically envelops the viewer. The emotional resonance comes from spatial surprise.
You turn a corner and are suddenly bathed in golden light from an unseen window.
Or the volumes of the rooms expand and contract, compressing you in a narrow corridor before releasing you into a soaring oval dome.
In Italy, churches and piazzas formed unified ensembles. Every broken pediment, every twisting column, every sculpted angel, and every painted cloud was entirely subordinated to a single overarching dramaturgy.
While the Italians used this highly emotional Baroque toolkit to project religious authority and doctrinal fervor, the style eventually migrated north across the Alps to France.
And this is where the narrative shifts entirely. Because in France, the style was stripped of its intense religious mysticism and completely repurposed to serve a different kind of deity, the absolute monarch.
This brings us to French restraint, or French classicism, developed primarily under the reigns of Louis XIII, Louis XIV, and Louis XV.
The French took one look at the undulating, rippling facades of Rome and said, absolutely not.
Yeah, they were not interested. The French version prioritized rational geometry, monumental scale, regularity, and strict symmetry over the exuberant curves of the Italian style.
We see a literal, highly public rejection of the Italian aesthetic orchestrated by Louis XIV. The king wanted to expand his royal palace in Paris, the Louvre.
So in 1665, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the most famous architect in the world, traveled to Paris to submit a design for the east wing of the Louvre.
Bernini proposed a massive dynamic facade with deep curves and dramatic projections. It was pure, emotional Italian Baroque.
And Louis XIV rejected it. He sent the most famous architect in the world packing.
Why? What did that rejection actually mean?
It was a massive geopolitical and aesthetic statement. It signaled a divergence in the purpose of architecture. The French monarchy wanted to communicate absolute, unshakable power.
But they believed that true power was best represented by unyielding order, discipline, and control, rather than emotional turbulence and movement.
Exactly. They chose a severely classical, highly restrained design submitted by a committee that included Claude Perrault and Louis Laveau.
It features a massive, flat, mathematically precise colonnade of paired Corinthian columns. It looks like an impenetrable fortress of logic.
And this logic of absolute control reached its ultimate expression outside of Paris at the Palace of Versailles.
Versailles started as a relatively modest brick and stone hunting pavilion for Louis XIII, but Louis XIV, the Sun King, decided to transform it into the center of the French universe.
He forced his entire government and the high nobility to move there so he could keep a watchful eye on them. The architects Louis Laveau and later Jules Hardouin-Mansart expanded the structure to monumental, almost incomprehensible proportions.
Versailles is the physical embodiment of absolute rule. Hardouin-Mansart constructed the famous Hall of Mirrors between 1678 and 1684.
And we have to look closely at the mechanics of this room to understand its power. It is a massive gallery, 73 meters long.
Along one side is a row of 17 arcaded windows looking out onto the gardens. Directly opposite those windows are 17 massive arcades filled with 357 individual mirrors.
And we have to remember, in the 17th century, creating a mirror of that clarity and size was incredibly difficult and astronomically expensive.
Venice held a monopoly on mirror making, right?
They did. The French literally had to smuggle Venetian glassmakers into France to pull this off. It was a flex of unimaginable wealth.
A flex of wealth and a flex of physics. By placing the mirrors directly opposite the windows, Hardouin-Mansart completely manipulated the natural light.
During the day, the sunlight floods in, hits the mirrors, and bounces back, making the solid inner wall disappear into a reflection of the outside.
The room appears twice as wide as it actually is, flooded with an ethereal glow. And at night, when lit by thousands of candles, the reflections cascade into infinity.
It was designed to visually dissolve the physical boundaries of the room, framing the king, who would walk down the center, in a halo of infinite light.
The control extended far beyond the walls of the palace. We cannot discuss Versailles without mentioning the control of nature itself. André Lenotre, the landscape architect, designed the formal gardens.
And he utilized strict, punishing geometry. There are perfectly straight, infinitely long gravel alleys. There are precise, circular pools of water.
Trees were meticulously pruned into geometric shapes, and flower beds were arranged in complex, symmetrical patterns called parterres.
The garden is literally an architectural extension of the palace. It is the monarch declaring that his mastery extends over the natural world, over dirt, water, and plants.
This focus on strict order and regulation also scaled down to urban domestic life in Paris through the development of the Hôtel Particulier.
These were aristocratic townhouses built for the nobility. They were defined by a highly regulated sequence of spaces.
You had a high wall facing the chaotic street. You enter through a massive gate into a perfectly symmetrical, walled courtyard in the front, known as the Cour d'Honneur.
The main house sits at the back of the courtyard, and behind the house is a private, geometrically ordered garden. It enforced rigid symmetry and social hierarchy even in the middle of a dense city.
Looking at all this, the straight lines of the Louvre colonnade, the geometric gardens, the flat roofs of buildings like the Grand Trianon at Versailles, the French style seems entirely contradictory to the Italian movement.
It is a stark contrast for sure.
Historians group it under the Baroque umbrella, but it explicitly rejects the undulating facades, the broken pediments, the twisted columns, and the chaotic spatial movement we saw with Borromini. Is French Baroque really a form of Baroque architecture, or is it just a massive, highly decorated revival of Renaissance order?
That tension is exactly why the term French classicism is heavily preferred by many architectural historians. However, It absolutely retains core Baroque characteristics.
Where it aligns with the Baroque is in its massive scale, its overwhelming pomp, and the theatricality of its overall effect.
What the French architects did was shift the methodology. They achieved their grandeur not through warped walls, but through massive cubic volumes, steep mansarded roofs, and incredibly strict axial planning that dictated exactly how a human body was allowed to move through the space.
The drama was moved from the exterior facades, which remained restrained, rectilinear, and dignified, into the opulent sensory overload of the interior staterooms.
The Hall of Mirrors is intensely Baroque in its psychological and sensory impact. It overwhelms you, but that emotional impact is contained within a rigorously symmetrical, highly disciplined classical shell.
If France represents the strict, disciplined, heavily regulated side of the Baroque, Spain represents the exact diametric opposite. Spain took the Baroque toolkit and created an explosion of surface decoration that pushed the aesthetic to its absolute visual limits.
Abandoning structural logic entirely in favor of pure texture. This is the era of Spanish exuberance, largely defined by the Churrigueresque style.
Spanish Baroque moved completely away from the spatial, structural dynamism of the Italians and the strict rationalism of the French. Instead, it focused heavily, almost exclusively, on extreme surface ornamentation.
And the wealth pouring into Spain from its colonial holdings in the Americas funded this explosion of intricate design.
The Churrigueresque style gets its name from the Churriguera family, particularly José Benito de Churriguera.
Yes. They were a family of highly influential architects and sculptors who utterly dominated Spanish design from the late 17th century until about 1750.
The Churrigueresque is fascinating because it treats a building like a blank canvas meant to be completely covered.
It is characterized by a dense, almost suffocating array of decorative motifs applied like a separate screen over the face of a building.
It is so intricate, so layered with carved flowers, saints, angels, and abstract patterns that it often completely obscures the underlying architectural forms. You cannot tell where the weight-bearing walls are because they are hidden behind layers of stone lace.
They suffered from horror vécu, the fear of empty space. Every square inch had to be carved. And this is where we see the intense utilization of the estipite.
That inverted obelisk column that tapers toward the bottom. In Spain, they use the estipede everywhere, not as a structural support, but purely as a central element of ornamental decoration.
They would stack them, layer them with garlands, and carve them so deeply that the stone looked frail and delicate. We see this masterfully executed in José Benito de Churriguera's massive altarpieces, which look like towering forests of gilded wood.
We also see it in major civic spaces like the Plaza Mayor in Salamanca, built in 1729, which features highly decorated arcades and medallions.
Another prime example of this extreme surface texture is the Royal Hospice of San Fernando in Madrid, designed by Pedro de Ribera in 1722.
The main portal, the entrance of that building, is truly a riot of sculptural detail. It features broken pediments stacked on top of one another, drapery carved out of stone that looks like it is blowing in the wind, and an absolute abundance of floral and figural ornamentation crawling up the facade.
When you stand in front of the Royal Hospice portal, your eye has no place to rest. The visual density is staggering.
This approach feels fundamentally different from the structural puzzles of Borromini in Italy. Borromini was bending the actual walls. Is it fair to describe the Churrigueresque approach as essentially architectural icing on a cake?
That is a very apt way to put it.
What I mean is the building itself, the actual floor plan and the load-bearing walls might just be a standard structural box, a very normal building. But the exterior surface, the facade, is completely smothered in heavy, detached decoration that has nothing to do with holding the building up.
That analogy perfectly captures the structural reality of the style. In the Italian Baroque, the ornament is deeply integrated with the architectural form to enhance the sense of physical movement and structural tension.
The shape of the building itself does the heavy emotional lifting.
In the Spanish Baroque, the ornament is applied as a detached decorative screen. The emotional impact, that profound sense of awe that the Counter-Reformation demanded, came from overwhelming visual richness.
It is a spectacle of texture. The structure of the building was entirely secondary to the surface spectacle.
And this intensely decorative, highly visual Spanish style did not stay confined to Europe. As the Spanish and Portuguese empires expanded, they exported this architectural language across the Atlantic to the Americas.
And this is where the history of the Baroque becomes incredibly complex. When European architectural blueprints collided with the indigenous cultures, materials, and labor forces of the Americas, it created something entirely new and culturally profound.
We're moving into the global reach of the style, specifically the mestizo Baroque and the concept of the counterconquest.
The expansion of the Baroque into Latin America is arguably one of the most significant and fascinating architectural developments of the era. European colonists, particularly the highly organized Jesuit missionaries, brought the Baroque style to the massive territories of the viceroyalties of New Spain, which is modern-day Mexico and Peru.
The goal was twofold, really: to promote the rapid evangelization of the indigenous populations and to assert unshakable imperial dominance over the newly conquered lands. A massive, towering stone church was a physical claim on the territory.
However, the Europeans lacked the workforce to build these grand structures. They had the blueprints, but not the masons. Therefore, they relied heavily on indigenous crafters as well as enslaved populations to actually carve the stone and raise the walls.
And because the hands doing the carving belonged to local artisans, what occurred was not a mere sterile replication of European templates. It was a profound syncretism, a blending of two entirely different worlds.
The local artisans took the European designs and infused them with their own local materials, their own ancient stone carving techniques, and crucially, their own cultural and religious symbols.
In Mexico, we see the development of the Mexican churrigueresque, also known as ultra-Baroque. A stunning example of this is the Church of Santa Prisca in Taxco.
It was built relatively late, between 1751 and 1758. It was funded entirely by a deeply wealthy local silver magnate.
The church is constructed out of a highly distinct local pink Cantera stone. The stone itself gives the building a vibrant, warm quality that you do not see in European marble.
The exterior layers deeply carved vegetal motifs, angels, and saints in a massive, soaring hierarchy of depth. We also see the height of this style inside the Cathedral of Mexico City, specifically at the Altar of the Kings.
This altar was designed by Hieronymo de Balbas between 1718 and 1737. It pioneered the use of massive gilded tiers and dynamic asymmetry in the New World.
Balbas introduced the estipit column to Mexico, and the indigenous carvers took it and multiplied it into a glittering wall of gold that looks entirely whiteless.
Further south, deep in the Andes Mountains, in the viceroyalty of Peru and modern-day Bolivia, we see the emergence of what historians call the Andean, or mestizo Baroque. Here, the fusion of cultures is even more explicit.
Traditional Iberian architectural forms were visibly fused with ancient Quechua motifs. The Church of San Lorenzo de Carangas in the mining city of Potosi is a striking, undeniable example of this hybridity.
If you look closely at the heavily carved stone facade of San Lorenzo de Carangas, you see things that would make a European bishop do a double take.
Yes, there are Catholic saints. But right alongside them, the indigenous stoneworkers carved local flora and fauna. There are maize stalks, which were sacred in Andean culture.
There are abstract geometric patterns derived from ancient textiles. There are even llamas carved into the stone.
And most remarkably, the facade actually features a depiction of an Inca princess carved directly into the religious iconography.
And in Brazil, operating under Portuguese influence rather than Spanish, we see the rise of the Mineiro Baroque, which peaked in the 18th century during the massive regional gold rush in Minas Gerais.
The defining figure of this movement is the architect and sculptor Antonio Francisco Lisboa, who is widely known as Aleijadinho. He designed the Church of San Francisco de Assis in the city of Ouro Preto, which was consecrated in 1774.
Aleijadinho's work is brilliant because he adapted to extreme constraints. The terrain in the mining region was rugged and uneven, and they did not have access to massive blocks of European marble.
So he utilized local soapstone, which is softer and allows for incredibly intricate, deeply undercut carving. He created undulating, convex facades with central circular towers that stood in stark, beautiful contrast to the mountainous terrain.
He carved highly expressive, almost agonizingly emotive figures of prophets out of the soapstone that lined the stairways, giving the Brazilian Baroque a deeply unique, visceral character.
Looking at all of this across the Americas, there is a massive uncomfortable tension. The Baroque was fundamentally designed in Europe by absolute monarchs and the papacy as a tool of total control.
Right, it was meant to demand doctrinal submission.
Yet in the Americas, this very same architectural style became a canvas for subjugated populations to express their own identity, to preserve their heritage in stone.
The Cuban author José Lezama Lima examined this dynamic and suggested that this Americanized Baroque was an act of what he called counter-conquest.
He argued that indigenous artists were actively avoiding cultural erasure by quietly, subversively embedding their own ancestral heritage right into the faces of the colonizers' grandest buildings.
But this begs a serious question. Did the European patrons, the bishops and the governors, actually realize that their massive monuments of imperial power were being structurally altered with indigenous religious and cultural symbols?
Right. Did they know there was an Inca princess on the church?
That question sits at the very center of the debate surrounding the Latin American Baroque. Historians look at this dynamic from two distinct viewpoints.
On one hand, you have Lizama Lima's perspective of the counter-conquest. This views the syncretism as a deeply subversive act.
The indigenous carvers were sneaking their gods into the Catholic pantheon, ensuring their cultural survival right under the noses of the Spanish. It frames the architecture as a site of quiet rebellion.
And what is the other viewpoint?
On the other hand, historians like Jorge Luis Marzo argue that this hybrid aesthetic was not a secret rebellion, but actually a highly calculated, deliberate system of political tactics deployed by the colonizers themselves.
Marzo suggests that the Spanish and Portuguese authorities were entirely aware of the maize stalks and the indigenous symbols. He argues they actively permitted this feigned inclusion of local iconography as a psychological tool to pacify the local populations.
If the indigenous people saw elements of their own culture reflected in the new European religion, they might be more easily converted and assimilated.
It was a strategy of appeasement that allowed the colonizers to maintain severe, rigid social hierarchies and absolute control while presenting a facade of inclusion.
The architecture itself stands as a massive, complex, physical record of a society defined by both transculturation and extreme violent inequality.
It is a powerful reminder that buildings are never just neutral piles of stone and mortar. They are the physical manifestations of the societies, the economies, and the power struggles that build them.
Now, while transculturation defined the Baroque and the vast expanding territories of the Americas back in the Mediterranean, a completely different set of pressures created another highly distinct variant of the style.
We are going to travel to the island of Sicily to examine what is known as the Sicilian anomaly.
Sicilian Baroque is a fascinating regional variant because it was born out of sudden, absolute catastrophe. It developed its most distinct characteristics relatively late in the period.
In 1693, a massive, devastating earthquake struck the Val di Noto region of southeastern Sicily. Entire cities, dozens of towns, were leveled to the ground in a matter of minutes.
The destruction required the mass, rapid reconstruction of entire urban landscapes.
When you have to rebuild entire cities from scratch, you cannot wait for shipments of pristine white marble to arrive from the mainland. You use the materials closest at hand.
And the material they had in terrifying abundance was local volcanic lava stone harvested from the slopes of Mount Etna.
Using volcanic stone completely altered the visual language of the buildings. The architects used this dark, porous lava stone to create stark, high-contrast effects on the facades.
They would pair the dark gray and black lava stone with lighter local limestone. This naturally baked the Baroque love for chiaroscuro, the dramatic theatrical interplay of light and dark, directly into the very masonry of the buildings.
I find the resourcefulness here striking. Mount Etna was the volatile force that routinely threatened to destroy their cities, and yet they used the very cooled lava of that volcano as the primary building material to construct their grandest, most permanent structures.
It is a beautiful defiance of nature. Beyond the striking color palette of the volcanic stone, the architects operating in Sicily developed several highly unique features that differentiate their work heavily from the mainland Italian style of Rome or Naples.
The provincial architects in Sicily initially looked at prints of what Borromini and Bernini were doing, but they quickly adapted those ideas to the local topography and the very specific, slightly eccentric cultural traditions of the island.
One of the most noticeable quirks is the ornamentation. In Rome, you see angels and saints. In Sicily, they heavily featured grotesque masks and glaring putti, those chubby angelic figures supporting balconies and decorating the entablatures above doors.
But these were not serene angels. These grinning, often unsettling faces were actually a relic of older, pre-17th century Sicilian architecture.
The local craftsmen simply refused to let go of their traditional motifs, so they integrated them directly into the new, sweeping curves of the Baroque aesthetic.
The balconies themselves became a major focal point. After roughly 1633, we see the widespread introduction of highly intricate, bulging wrought iron balustrades on these balconies.
They curve outward like swollen bellies, adding to the three-dimensional movement of the streetscape. Furthermore, the topography of the rebuilt cities was often steep and uneven. To deal with this, architects designed elaborate, sweeping external double staircases.
If you were visiting a wealthy family in a Sicilian palazzo, your carriage would enter from the street through a massive archway into a central courtyard.
To get to the main reception rooms, you would face a complex, symmetrical double staircase leading up to the piano nobile, which is the principal, VIP floor of the house.
These staircases were not just functional, they would switch back, turn inwards and outwards multiple times, becoming major sculptural features in their own right, turning the simple act of walking upstairs into a theatrical procession.
And once inside the churches, the floors were often heavily decorated with intricate inlaid colored marble, a technique known as intarsia, creating dizzying geometric patterns underfoot.
But perhaps the single most distinct architectural feature of the Sicilian style is how they handled the belfry. In mainland Italy, church bells were typically housed in a separate, freestanding tower called a campanile, usually located to the side or the rear of the church.
In Sicily, the architects abandoned the separate tower. They integrated the bells directly onto the principal facade of the building itself.
They would build an intricately sculpted, heavily decorated open arcade at the very highest point of the facade, often surmounting the central pediment, and hang the bells right there against the open sky.
This resulted in facades that were highly vertical, drawing the eye up to the bells, creating a theatrical silhouette that feels entirely distinct from the heavy, massive domes of Rome.
Summarizing the massive global footprint of this architectural movement is dizzying. We have seen the Baroque stretch from the dark volcanic slopes of Sicily to the high altitudes of the Andes Mountains.
We have traced it from the rigidly ordered, punishing geometry of the gardens at Versailles to the undulating, rippling stone facades of Rome.
We started by looking at how the Baroque began as a highly calibrated Counter-Reformation tool deployed by the Catholic Church in Italy to overwhelm the senses and project divine authority.
We saw how it morphed into a symbol of rigid, absolute monarchy in France, emphasizing massive scale and rational order.
We saw it explode into a dense, overwhelming, detached screen of pure surface decoration in Spain with the Churrigueresque.
And finally, we explored how it became a complex, deeply contested site of cultural hybridity, transculturation, and perhaps resistance in Latin America.
Architectural styles, however, cannot sustain maximum intensity forever. By the 1730s, the intense, heavy drama, the deep shadows, and the overwhelming emotional weight of the Baroque began to exhaust the patrons.
It slowly evolved into the lighter, more playful, and highly decorative Rococo style, which flourished particularly in Central Europe and France.
Rococo kept the curves but lost the heavy religious and political solemnity. But eventually, both the heavy Baroque and the playful Rococo were entirely swept away and replaced by neoclassicism in the late 18th century.
Neoclassicism was a direct, harsh reaction against the perceived excesses, the chaotic movement, and the emotional manipulation of the Baroque. The neoclassical architects sought a strict return to the perceived purity, the structural restraint, and the rigid rational order of classical antiquity.
They wanted perfectly straight columns and perfect circles again, perfectly aligning with the philosophical shifts of the Age of Enlightenment, which prioritized reason and empirical logic over emotional awe.
It is a continuous, fascinating pendulum swing in human history. We swing from the strict rationalism of the Renaissance into the intense emotionalism of the Baroque and back into the strict rationalism of neoclassicism.
And studying this cycle leaves us with a vital perspective on how we interact with the built environment around us right now. We often hear the phrase that architecture is frozen music.
If that is true, then Baroque architecture is an operatic battleground. It was a style explicitly, unapologetically designed to persuade, to overwhelm, and to control the human mind through sensory input.
This raises an important question for us in the modern era. Consider how the physical buildings of today project power. When you walk into a towering, modern corporate skyscraper, a vast, sprawling tech campus, or a monumental government building with massive concrete pillars, what psychological and emotional responses are those specific structures engineered to extract from you?
And more importantly, when you feel that sense of awe or intimidation, who really controls the narrative of those spaces?
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.